In this video, I'm going to explain how we can use equilibrium analysis to understand how prices and quantities change in competitive markets. So, equilibrium analysis is a tool that everyone has to be able to understand how to use in order to do basic economics. So, let's look at the steps. First, you draw a basic graph. Price is on the y-axis and quantities on the x-axis. Then we add a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve, and we label them D and S so we understand which one is demand and which one is supply. The point where the demand and supply curve intersect is the equilibrium point, which tells us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. If the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are not the same, we're not in equilibrium. We either have a surplus or a shortage, but we're not in equilibrium. We're not in balance. Now, we use the facts of understanding the situation and we determine what, if anything, in the market is changing that would change supply and demand. There are 6 things that change supply. There are 6 things that change demand. If one of those things is changing, then we have to change the demand or supply curve and draw new demand and supply curves and label them as such. Once we've done that, we can easily determine the new equilibrium point where supply and demand now intersect and what the new equilibrium price and quantity are. Let me show you by doing an actual example. Let's say we have a set of facts. Example 1. We're in Philadelphia and the market price of a Philadelphia cheesesteak sandwich is $10. At that price, there are 200,000 sandwiches that are sold each day in the market. Now we make an assumption. We understand the Pope is going to be visiting Philadelphia, and a lot of people are going to be coming there. So while the Pope is there, the population of Philadelphia is going to be much larger. I assume it doubles. Well, what happens to the demand, supply, and quantity and price of Philadelphia cheesesteaks? Well, we start out by drawing a two-dimensional graph with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. We draw an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve, and we know that from the facts the equilibrium price is $10, and at the equilibrium price of $10 the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied is 200,000 sandwiches. How do we know that? Because that's how many sandwiches are sold each day. So that's where we begin. Now we look at the next fact. Something is changing in this market. The population is going to double because the Pope is going to be visiting Philadelphia. When the population increases, that's one of the factors that increases demand. So demand will move from D to D2. And we'll have a new equilibrium point, E2. We can easily see by looking at the new equilibrium point where the new demand curve D2 intersects the existing supply curve. We'll stop and note for a second. The supply curve hasn't changed. The supply curve is the same. The equilibrium happens at a different point on the supply curve. But the supply curve itself hasn't changed. We just moved to a different point along the supply curve. So at E2, there's a higher price and a higher quantity, because the balance between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded happens at a higher quantity and at a higher price. So when we want to know what happens to demand, supply, and quantity and price, all we have to do is draw the new curve, in this case it's the demand curve based on the change, and look at the point where the new curve intersects the existing supply curve. It shows us as a higher price and a higher quantity. Now I will mention, based on the facts that we said here, we don't know the price is going to be exactly $15. I use $15 because it's higher than 10. We just know it's going to be a higher price. Same thing with the quantity. We don't know there's nothing in these set of facts that tells us that it's going to be 300,000 at E2. But we do know it's going to be more than 200,000. The quantity has to be higher and the price has to be higher. That's what the analysis, the tool, using the tool and the analysis allows us to know up front what would the actual price and the actual quantity be. Well, we'd know that after the fact. We'd be able to go in the market and see what the quantity was and what the price was. But it would definitely be a higher quantity and a higher price. We can tell that before it even happens based on the facts of the case and based on using the tool or equilibrium analysis tool. And so the demand would increase. We'd move from D to D2. The supply would be unchanged. We'd move from a different point on the supply curve, but the supply curve itself would be unchanged. The quantity would be increased and the price would increase. And eventually we wind up at E2, and in this graph it looks like the price would be higher. It would be 15, and the quantity supplied, the quantity demanded at the new equilibrium point would also be higher. It would be 300,000 units. We can look at another example, and we will look at a number of examples. Let's say we have the same facts. The Philadelphia cheesesteak, 200,000 units at $10. Now we assume the price of a turkey sandwich decreases from $9.50 to $6.50. Now I know what you're saying. A turkey sandwich is not a substitute for a Philadelphia cheesesteak, but for our purposes, we can assume that it is a substitute for a Philadelphia cheesesteak. And so, again, we start off with our two-dimensional graph, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, put the facts in. $10 is the equilibrium price, the equilibrium quantity is 200,000 units, and then what happens? We have a substitute in the marketplace. A turkey sandwich decreases from $9.50 to $6.50. Well, what that's going to do, we know that's one of the factors that changes demand when the price of a substitute decreases. So when the price of a substitute, the turkey sandwich, decreases from $9.50 to $6.50, the demand for Philadelphia cheesesteaks decreases. Some people who used to buy a Philadelphia cheesesteak will now buy a turkey sandwich. And so the demand shifts down from D to D2. And we're at a new equilibrium point, E2, which represents a lower price for the Philadelphia cheesesteaks and a lower quantity. And again, I have $6 and 100,000 units in because based on the graph, it looks like that's about what the numbers would tell us. But we don't know exactly that it's going to be $6 and exactly it's going to be 100,000. We do know, though, it has to be a lower price and a lower quantity, representing the equilibrium E2. So demand decreases, supply is unchanged, the quantity decreases and the price decreases. We'll wind up at a new equilibrium E2, where the 100,000 sandwiches are sold at a price of $6. Example 3. Same set of facts. We're in Philadelphia with the cheesesteaks, but now we assume each resident of Philadelphia receives a monetary payment for their role in the movie Rocky IV. What would happen to price, supply, to demand, supply, quantity, and price? Well, we start with our equilibrium situation. We know what it is beforehand. Then something happens. Every resident of Philadelphia gets a royalty payment for their part in the movie Rocky IV. The demand, in this case, a royalty payment is an increase in income. We know that when income increases, that demand increases. It's one of the 6 factors that affects demand. An increase in income results in more people demanding more of everything. So the demand curve shifts out from D to D2. The new equilibrium point where the new demand curve intersects the existing supply curve represents a higher quantity and a higher price. So demand increases, supply is unchanged, quantity increases, and price increases. And again, why did this happen? Because something happened in the marketplace that was one of the factors that affects demand. And when people's incomes increase, we know that demand increases. People demand more of everything. Demand curve shifts from D to D2. We have the new equilibrium point with a higher quantity and a higher price. Now we have another example, example 4. Let's assume the price of the cheese that's used in the Philadelphia cheesesteak increases by 50%. Maybe there's a shortage of cows, there's less milk being produced, less cheese being made, and um, and so the price of cheese as a result increases by 50%. What happens in the market for cheesesteaks? We start with our equilibrium situation, and then we have to consider this fact. If the price of cheese increases, well, cheese is a factor of production for the product Philadelphia cheesesteak. When the price of a factor of production increases, supply decreases. Suppliers can't supply the same amount at the same prices. So supply decreases. And we see the curve shifts to the left. We have a new equilibrium point E2, which represents a lower quantity and a higher price. And one of the things you should, hopefully you've noticed by now, is there's a very mechanical nature to all this. When the curve shifts, we have a new equilibrium point, and the reason we don't have to really memorize what happens is if we know how to move the curves, then we can just read the new price and the new quantity off of the graph. We know the price has to be higher and the quantity has to be lower. How do we know that? Because E2 represents the situation with a lower quantity and a higher price. So demand is unchanged, supply increases, quantity decreases, and the price increases. And we have a new equilibrium. Less sandwiches at higher prices. Here's another example. We assume that half the shops that sell Philadelphia cheesesteaks close because of health code violations. How could that happen? Well, let's try to understand what happens in the marketplace. What happens to demand, supply, quantity, and price? Equilibrium analysis can help us figure that out. So we try to account for that fact. Many of the stores are now closing. We know supply is decreasing. Why? Because the number of sellers is one of the factors that affects the supply. If the number of sellers is less, the supply is less. The supply curve shifts to the left from S to S2. And S2 intersects the existing demand curve D at E2, which represents a higher price and a lower quantity. And so there's a common sense element to this. We know that if there's less, if many of the stores are going to be closing, there's going to be less sandwiches sold, and maybe the prices will be higher. But the equilibrium analysis tool, the demand and supply analysis, helps us understand that, and we don't have to know beforehand what happens. We can just use the tool to draw it out, move the curves, and then understand from the new curve what happens to price and quantity. And so in this case here, when the stores are closed down because of the health code violations, demand isn't changed, supply decreases, quantity decreases. Supply decreases, quantity decreases, and the prices increase. And we have a new equilibrium E2, less sandwiches, higher price. Here's an example, example 6. Now we say the price of cheese curls, which use the same cheese to make cheesesteaks and cheese curls, decreases by 50%. What happens here? Well, if you remember, so prices of related goods, substitutes in production, will affect supply. So we know that cheese curls and Philadelphia cheesesteaks both use a factor of production. They that can be substituted. You can either use the cheese to make cheesesteaks or cheese curls. When the price of cheese curls goes down, they're going to be willing to pay less in order to get the cheese, and so the amount of cheese available to the cheesesteak manufacturers is going to be greater, and so they're going to be able to get more cheese, and the result is that the supply of cheesesteaks increases. The curve moves from S to S2. And again, this is because the cheesesteaks and the cheese curls are related goods. They're substitutes in production because they both use the same factor of production to produce the end product. When the price of cheese curls goes down, more of that cheese goes to the cheese steak manufacturers, and they're able to supply more, and supply increases. When that happens, the quantity increases, but they're also able to lower their prices. They can sell more cheesesteaks to uh, um, the price of their factory production went down in the process. They're able to offer the more cheesesteaks at lower prices, which is what happens when supply increases. And so we eventually reach the equilibrium with a higher quantity and a lower price. And then we'll look at example 7, and this will be our last example. Here we have a new grill machine that gets invented, new technology that reduces the time it takes for an employee to make a sandwich from 5 minutes to 1 minute. So we can make our cheesesteak sandwiches faster. Presumably in an hour's time, we're able to make more cheesesteaks than we could in the past. We can maybe have, the employee becomes more productive in that process. So we try to say, okay, what happens here? Well, if we start at our equilibrium, we know that when there's an increase or an improvement in technology, then that enables us to have an increase in supply. And that's exactly what happens here. The people who make cheesesteaks can now make them more efficiently. They can make more of them. They can supply more of them at a lower price. And so the supply curve moves out to the right. Supply increases. We have a larger number of cheesesteaks being sold at a lower price. And that's what happens when supply increases. And so we have the new equilibrium at E2 with a higher quantity being supplied and demanded and a lower price existing in the marketplace. And so hopefully these examples have showed you how you can use equilibrium analysis, and supply and demand analysis is the same thing, supply, demand, and equilibrium analysis, to understand markets and understand how changes in demand or changes in supply or changes in both will result in changes to the equilibrium prices and the equilibrium quantities in a market. And when there's a change in supply or a change in demand, you can easily use the tool to figure out what happens to the quantity and the price in the new equilibrium.